within the...
Hit the press button.
Yeah,
The red
you'll
light is
come
Okay,
on.
great. The Select Committee will come to order. Good morning, and thank you all for being here. Thank you to our witnesses. This is my first hearing as chairman of the Select Committee on the CCP, and I'm grateful to be here with our colleagues on both sides of the aisle, and especially Ranking Member Krishnamurthy. He's been very gracious and has said that he and Gallagher had a good thing going. Don't screw it up. So I think we're off to a good start. When the United States invests abroad, we share our democratic values, the rule of law, and respect for human rights. We seek to lift those who work with us, protect the local environment, bolster local institutions, and work to create lasting, positive partnerships between nations. The Chinese Communist Party does not think like us. When it invests abroad, it does so in the name of control. It exports authoritarianism and exploits people and natural resources in service of its own mercantilist interests. The CCP's Belt and Road Initiative, the subject of today's hearing, is officially a program where Beijing invests in critical resources, transportation, and digital infrastructure in lower and middle-income countries. In reality, BRI has only one purpose: to expand the CCP's influence and control around the world. The CCP uses investment dollars to entramp unassuming countries in debt, gain territorial control and influence, expand the reach of its surveillance state, and dominate critical supply chains. For the CCP, development finance is a weapon to undercut U.S. influence, challenge U.S. interests, and bring countries around the world under its authoritarian thumb. Any suggestion that the BRI is about altruistic investment is a lie. The Chinese Communist Party is not interested in building infrastructure to be a friendly neighbor or even to make a profit. It wants strategic control, and it wants it at the expense of the United States and liberal values. Through the BRI, heavily subsidized Chinese companies purchase and develop mines to secure Beijing's control of critical global supply chains. Chinese firms get cheap credit to construct strategically located ports, giving Beijing the power to restrict U.S. access, collect valuable intelligence, and exploit the ports for economic and security gains. The CCP builds telecommunications networks with built-in surveillance and cybersecurity risks to advance its ultimate goal of technology-enabled authoritarianism. And the list goes on. Economic viability does not matter. Beijing readily loses billions building shoddy infrastructure and constructing CCP-controlled 5G networks at less than half the price of Western alternatives, all for the promise of influence. U.S. alternatives cannot compete on those terms. The CCP's campaign of control entraps developing countries. Poor infrastructure construction leads to dangerous safety conditions on roads and in mines. Chinese workers are imported to displace local workers. And the CCP makes no pretense of respecting the environment, squandering the natural resources of the host country. Corruption increases, human rights are ignored, institutions are weakened, and democratic backsliding is almost guaranteed. We need to confront the CCP's Belt and Road Initiative head-on. Nations are desperate for an alternative to the CCP's poorly built roads, corrupt digital infrastructure, and crooked loans. However, if the CCP shows up, it's hard to turn it away. The United States needs to step up and take action. That means reforming our development arsenal and finding creative ways to collaborate with like-minded allies. This includes enhancing the ability of the Development Finance Corporation to work with a larger variety of partners around the world. There is also an urgent need to reform and revitalize the Export-Import Bank as an arm of American strategic investment. I look forward to hearing David Trulio's recommendation on how to do just that. We also need to provide support to governments most at risk from CCP influence and to reinforce international institutions against Beijing's grip. Dan Rundy has been an outspoken on our role our aid agencies played in all but eliminating the AIDS pandemic from Africa and expanding internet access. And I look forward to hearing his ideas on how we can build on this record of success. I also look forward to hearing from Dr. Brad Parks about ways that we can utilize aid to support our interests and prevent partners in the developing world from signing up for more than they bargained for. We have a lot to cover today, so now I yield to Ranking Member Krishnamurthy for his opening statement.
Congrats, Mr. Chair. Thank you again, and thank you to the witnesses and the audience for your attention to this very important topic. In 2013, Xi Jinping launched the Belt and Road Initiative, also known as BRI. Xi's vision was to connect the PRC, the People's Republic of China, to the rest of the world through infrastructure. As you can see here on this visual, 11 years later, believe it or not, over 75% of the countries of the world have signed up for this initiative, which has involved over $1 trillion in Chinese investment and loans. But the BRI is more than economics. Xi Jinping calls it a, quote, solution for China to build a community of common human destiny, an ominous-sounding euphemism for a world order led by the CCP. To him, that means political influence, military installations, and more. I'll make 4 points here. First, the BRI fits squarely within the CCP's military ambitions. As we'll see, many BRI projects, especially deep water ports, are tailored for military use. China's military, the People's Liberation Army, the PLA, is deeply invested in the BRI and talks about using ports and other projects as part of its, quote, going global strategy. And we know that by PRC law, any civilian asset around the world must be made available to the PLA at its demand. Second, BRI projects are not known for their high quality, and that's an understatement. Take the Coca-Codo-Sinclair Dam in Ecuador, for example. Despite costing almost $3 billion, the dam's reservoir is clogged with silt and has over 17,000 cracks, forcing the dam to operate below capacity or risk failure. The dam project has also contributed to massive landslides, which took out this road right here and had an oil spill that's harmed over 150,000 people in the area, many of whom are indigenous. Third, the BRI is plagued with corruption and bribery. In the case of this dam in Ecuador, for instance, China bribed almost every single official involved with the project, including then-President Lenin Moreno. Here's a picture of him with former Premier Lee. Over 10 years, Moreno and other officials allegedly received almost $80 million in bribes. bribes over a decade, 80 million. And fourth, these projects bring massive debt. China is the world's single largest official creditor, having lent up to $1.5 trillion. A whopping 80% of Chinese government loans have gone to countries in debt distress. It's no wonder that people consider China to be the ultimate predator-creditor. Zambia is a case in point. It owes China an estimated $6 billion, equivalent to Zambia's government expenditures for an entire year. One study found that while China's projects boosted Zambian GDP, they raised foreign interest payments so high that the government had to cut health care, social services, and other domestic programs. Now, with all these problems, the question becomes how we in the United States must respond. I say we need our own BRI, but it stands for Bring Real Improvement. First, it starts with recognizing that these countries around the world will need economic development. They will get their deep water ports. They will get their infrastructure projects. The question is from whom? Will it be China or will it be the United States and our partners? I say it should be us. Bring real improvement. Second, our BRI means our projects must be transparent, high quality, and not burdensome for our taxpayers. We can do this. We can do this through modest reforms, through institutions like the Development Finance Corporation, known as the DFC, and we can make offerings that actually compete attractively in comparison to the Chinese BRI projects. Bring real improvement. This is what bringing real improvement really looks like. On the left is this visual. Women in Tech, it's a Women in Tech event hosted by Africell, an African telecoms company that the DFC supported. This DFC project replaced Huawei infrastructure and trained locals, bringing local jobs and boosting the economy sustainably. This is what bringing real improvement looks like. The picture on the right, that's Chinese. It's a Chinese oil agreement recently signed with Angola, male only, in a boardroom choreographed and controlled. We can do better than that. Thank you so much, and I look forward to the discussion.
Thank you, Ranking Member Krishnamurthy. If any other member wishes to submit a statement for the record, without objection, those statements will be added to the record. Today, we are privileged to be joined by a great panel of witnesses who have been on the front lines with U.S. global investment and competition. Our first witness is Mr. David Trulio. Mr. Trulio is the President and Chief Executive Officer of the Ronald Reagan Presidential Foundation and Institute. Mr. Trulio brings a distinguished career of government service and expertise in strategic competition, having most recently served at the Export-Import Bank as counselor to the chairman and as Senior Vice President on China and transformational exports. Our second witness is Mr. Dan Rundy, currently a Senior Vice President at the Center for Strategic and International Studies. Mr. Rundy previously served at the U.S. Agency for International Development and the World Bank Group, and he helped create the International Development Finance Corporation through the BUILD Act, which we will discuss that today. Finally, we are joined by Dr. Brad Parks. Dr. Parks is the Executive Director of the AidData Research Lab at the College of William and Mary. Like Mr. Trulio and Mr. Rundy, Dr. Parks has also served in government, helping to stand up the Millennium Challenge Corporation. Thank you for being here, gentlemen, and with that, I'd like to welcome all the witnesses, and thank you all for being here this morning. Mr. Trulio, you are now recognized for your opening remarks.
Chairman Molinar, Ranking Member Krishnamurthy, distinguished members of the committee, thank you for your very important work and opportunity to testify today for all of us here on this panel. I'm pleased to discuss with you my views on how to address the CCP's global development and economic offensive. Of note, these are my own views and not necessarily the views of my current or previous employers. So simply put, as has been stated by the chair and ranking member, the People's Republic of China, led by the Chinese Communist Party, seeks to become the world's leading power and is challenging American interests, values, and influence. The PRC, it's important to recall, is a serious human rights abuser, and its approach to international economics is aggressive and coercive, making economies less free and less fair. No one who values freedom and democracy and genuine economic opportunity would want to live in a world dominated by the Chinese Communist Party. Through BRI, the PRC is developing China-centric global infrastructure, transportation, trade, and commercial networks in over 100 countries. Projects are put together using Chinese standards and expose host countries' sensitive infrastructure to PRC control or influence. The United States, working with its allies and partners, must successfully counter BRI. However, given our commitment to the rule of law, to transparency and democratic principles, our response to BRI must be consistent with our values, play to our strengths, and be inherently different from that of what the PRC offers. So what follows are a handful of major focus areas for discussion today. First, a key challenge is that responsibility and accountability for economic trade and related matters is spread across a vast range of executive departments and agencies. Unfortunately, there's no simple answer to the question, who's in charge? We need much greater focused responsibility and accountability, which brings me to my next point on strategy. Given all the economic players America has on the field, producing an executive branch strategy on international economic competition would necessarily force much needed thinking on priorities, trade-offs, courses of action, roles and responsibilities, results to date, and appropriate funding, or where appropriate, cutting. Now, when it comes to interagency teams, because our currently interagency players are often siloed, a noteworthy success driver to counter the present state is greater use of dedicated interagency teams. To that end, we should look to and consider lessons from the model of the National Counterterrorism Center. I'll now turn to my fourth point, which is incentives. For a whole-of-government approach to work optimally, Congress and the executive branch should ensure that federal employees have greater incentives to seek out and succeed in interagency assignments. And also, federal employee performance ratings and compensation should more fully take into account appropriate support to U.S. businesses engaged in global competition, including the number of deals supported and the number of U.S. company wins achieved. Now I'll turn to the Export-Import Bank of the United States, which represents a significant but underutilized tool of statecraft. As the official export credit agency of the United States, its mission is to support American jobs by facilitating the export of U.S. goods and services. Now, while I wish governments did not interfere in the free market, there are over 100 export credit agencies in the world, and it is unwise and unfair to American workers and companies to ask them to fend for themselves in the face of state-supported competition, particularly from the PRC. So when it comes to congressional oversight, I would recommend that EXIM's leadership be asked about results to date regarding the congressionally mandated China and Transformational Export Program, CTEP. And then more broadly, there are several proposals to increase EXIM's impact and support American jobs and employers. So for example, first among these issues, repeal the statutory prohibition on EXIM financing defense articles and defense services. That prohibition is outdated and makes no sense. Second, for competition in sectors key to America's long-term security and prosperity, replace EXIM's current U.S. content policies with an approach based on export value and job creation. Third, raise EXIM's 2% statutory default limit to 4%. And if the revised default rate is exceeded, allow 1 year to cure the default rate before it limits the operations of the bank. Fourth, update EXIM's underwriting standard from reasonable assurance of repayment to reasonable likelihood of repayment in order to enable EXIM to more effectively support U.S. companies competing against the PRC. Fifth, and finally, put into law through EXIM's charter the Make More in America initiative, an existing EXIM policy, but it's not in law yet. And that makes available the agency's existing medium and long-term loans, guarantees, and insurance available, which is very important. So in conclusion, this is a time of great consequence for our country and the world. Addressing these hard but pressing issues described above will contribute materially to our success. I commend the bipartisan work of the committee and look forward to being a resource to you. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Mr. Rundy, you may proceed.
Thank you. Thanks, Chair Molinar, Ranking Member Krishnamurthy, members of the committee. Thank you very much. My main message is this: in this era of great power competition, the United States needs an alternative solution rather than demand that developing countries cease working with the CCP. We can't fight something with nothing. So what's our something? That's the question. There's some hard truths we have to face. The CCP is the go-to financier and builder of infrastructure in the developing world. We don't have to meet China dollar for dollar, but we must be a better infrastructure investment partner. At the end of the day, infrastructure bends towards trading routes. If your #1 trading partner is China, then China-oriented infrastructure is going to follow. Ideally, we would lead the world on trade as we did 25 years ago. Unfortunately, BRI is an ambitious and hopeful project that speaks to the aspirations of China's friends and potential friends. I hate it because it's a great idea, because it inspires folks in the global south. It's just not our idea. And it comes at a good time for them, because over the next 15 years, more infrastructure is projected to be built globally than currently exists. The United States has attempted to respond to this challenge in a number of ways. Congress reauthorized the Exim Bank. That was great. Congress passed the BUILD Act, which established the DFC. Excellent. President Biden stood up something called a PGII, the Partnership for Global Infrastructure Investment. It's a work in progress. There have been attempts since 2019 to try and standardize quality infrastructure. There's something called the Blue Dot Network. It's also a work in progress. We haven't done enough. We've got to do a lot more, and that's why I think this hearing is so helpful and important. I have 7 recommendations. First, let's get America's soft power in order. The BUILD Act, AGOA, which is a Trade Preferences Act for Africa, and the Exim Bank are all going to be in front of the Congress for reauthorization in the next 2 years. I'd recommend we reauthorize them maybe with some tweaks. Okay, there's the Bipartisan Americas Act, which has been proposed as a new partnership for our neighbors in the Americas. That's in front of the Congress. There's a proposal in front of the Congress to finance a capital increase for the private sector arm of the Inter-American Development Bank. These are all actionable things that this Congress or our Congress could take in the next 2 years. Second, we're going to need a little bit more foreign aid to counter China. It's going to be on eye-glazingly boring stuff, but really important stuff. We need to find probably about $2 billion a year to do this to counter China. Third, we're going to have to strengthen development agencies. The DFC, which has been talked about, should be able to operate in places like Panama more easily. It should be able to operate more easily in places like Mexico more easily. So it needs to operate in middle and upper middle income countries. Congress will have an opportunity to change and raise the credit card limit on the DFC at its next reauthorization. The Millennium Challenge Corporation, started in the Bush administration, could be repurposed as an infrastructure response to the Belt and Road. It's never been fully funded, and it's something to look at. We should also look at the example of Power Africa. This was an initiative of the Obama administration that has endured across administrations, where AID is in the lead and different agencies have roles and responsibilities, and it's about providing financing and energy to Africa. And that's a good template. Okay. Fourth, we need to ride herd on the World Bank and the regional development banks. By that I mean we've got to have active leadership. And that as a result, it can be a force multiplier for American and Western forms of globalization. We should kick China out of having developing country status. It's totally bonkers that China gets to borrow money from the Asian Development Bank and the World Bank. Fifth, we're going to need to create some new vehicles sponsored by the U.S. government. I'd love to see us create an enterprise fund for undersea cables. I'd also like us to look at securitizing infrastructure projects in the developing world. The International Finance Corporation, as part of the World Bank, is looking at this. If we could crowd in Western institutional investors the way we do in the housing market in the United States, that would be a game changer for global infrastructure and a way to crowd in American private capital. 7, we got to do a bunch of boring stuff. We're going to have to train about 100,000 bureaucrats in the developing world to buy and manage infrastructure a heck of a lot better. This is eye-glazingly boring stuff. It's really important. Finally, we need to establish private sector consortia. We need to work with our allies and friends, and we need to bring together companies of allied nations that could work together to deliver projects that are just as turnkey ready as the way Belt and Road does it. They can bring money and they can move more quickly and they bring a whole bunch of stuff in one package. We need to work together to do that. That requires three things. We got to have better business intelligence. We got to be better in commercial diplomacy. And we got to be more coordinated and work better with our friends. Thank you.
Thank you. Dr. Parks, the floor is yours.
Good morning, Chairman Molinar, Ranking Member Krishnamurthy, and members of the committee. I'm honored to have the opportunity to speak with you. If you were sitting in Beijing right now and you were looking at a dashboard of China's overseas project portfolio, you would see a lot of flashing red lights. The Chinese authorities are dealing with three big problems at the same time. The first is debt repayment. Beijing went on a lending spree. It issued thousands of loans worth more than $1 trillion for big-ticket infrastructure projects spread across 125 countries. Now, its borrowers are having difficulty repaying their debts. 80% of China's overseas lending portfolio is currently supporting countries in financial distress. The second problem is that a lot of Beijing's overseas infrastructure projects are risky from an environmental, social, or governance perspective. When China first got into the global infrastructure market, it had only 17 problem projects, and they were worth less than $450 million. Today, it has nearly 1,700 problem projects worth more than $450 billion with a B. The third problem is reputational risk. As Belt and Road projects have run into trouble, Beijing has seen its public approval rating in the developing world plunge from 56% to 40%. Media sentiment has also soured. And with the grace periods on many Chinese loans expiring, Beijing now finds itself in an uncomfortable position as the developing world's largest official debt collector. It's navigating this transition at a time when many of its biggest borrowers are either illiquid or insolvent. But here's the thing. Beijing is not going to stand by and watch its flagship global infrastructure initiative crash and burn. The Chinese authorities have already launched a far-reaching effort to de-risk the Belt and Road Initiative. They call it BRI 2.0. In the short run, Beijing is scanning its global portfolio and firefighting in response to crises. It's refocusing its time and money on distressed borrowers, troubled projects, and sources of public backlash. But Beijing is also playing the long game. It's putting in place new safeguards to future-proof the BRI. China's making course corrections that address three different types of risk in its portfolio: repayment risk, project performance risk, and reputational risk. Beijing is taking several short-term measures to manage the risk of not being repaid. First, it's paying itself by sweeping dollars and euros out of the cash collateral accounts of borrowers. Then, if borrowers ask for some type of debt relief, like a temporary suspension of repayments, Beijing is requiring that they first replenish the accounts that they have depleted. Beijing is also ramping up emergency rescue lending to ensure that its biggest borrowers have enough cash on hand to service their outstanding project debts. So that's one part of the de-risking effort. But Beijing is also making long-term changes to its loan portfolio to reduce the risk of not being repaid in the future. Rather than relying on its own banks, Beijing is increasingly outsourcing risk management to lending institutions with stronger due diligence standards. It's dialing down its use of bilateral lending instruments, and it's dialing up the provision of credit through collaborative lending arrangements with Western commercial banks and multilateral institutions. With respect to project performance risk, Beijing is focused on addressing a common criticism of the BRI, that it privileges speed over safety. China's adopting increasingly robust ESG safeguards, but it's doing so in a way that preserves a long-standing source of competitive advantage, its reputation for implementing projects with lightning speed. Finally, with respect to reputational risk, China has recently experienced more losses than gains vis-a-vis Washington on 3 measures of soft power: public opinion, elite support, and the favorability of media coverage. But the Chinese authorities are not resting on their laurels. They're changing the way they allocate aid and credit. Beijing now channels most of its money to highly competitive jurisdictions. About 2/3 of Chinese aid and credit goes to toss-up countries. These are places where neither China nor the U.S. has an insurmountable lead over its rival. China's also doubling down in competitive jurisdictions once they start to lean towards Beijing and away from Washington. The bottom line is that Beijing is several steps ahead of its competitors. The U.S. and its G7 allies have underestimated the ambition of China's effort to overhaul Belt and Road. They are focused on competing with a version of the BRI that no longer exists, BRI 1.0 rather than BRI 2.0. Thank you so much for your time, and I look forward to your questions.
Thank you very much to all the witnesses. And now we'll move to questions, and I'll recognize myself for 5 minutes. Mr. Rundy, the BUILD Act, which transformed the Overseas Private Investment Corporation into the International Development Finance Corporation, expires next year. I think we would all agree that Congress should reauthorize, but what should be changed during this reauthorization?
Thank you, Chairman. I was very involved with the establishment of the BUILD Act. I think there's several things that are easy to do, and there's some harder things. So let me start with the easier ones. I think Congress has an opportunity to strategically increase the credit card limit. It's able to lend about $7, $8, or $9 billion a year, and it's got a credit card limit about 60 or 65 billion. There's an opportunity to raise the credit card limit in the next reauthorization for it to do more. Second, I was in favor at the time of saying we should focus on the poorest countries. I still think we should have an emphasis and special attention to poorer countries, but we need to make it easier for the DFC to work in middle and upper middle income countries. It's crazy that only 4 countries in the Western Hemisphere are qualified to work on kind of a clean basis at the DFC. My friends at the DFC will say, we can do stuff in the other countries, but you got to get like a permission slip to do it, and it's a real headache. I think we need to fix this and allow for middle and upper middle income countries. There's lots of ways to do this, but we need to look at that. My view is, I'm a Republican, I think we ought to have an all of the above energy policy. So I think since the Bush administration, increasingly there's been ratcheting up against oil and gas projects, especially in the poorest countries in the world. I don't believe any poor country is not gonna develop their oil and gas resources. I'd rather have us do it than somebody else. I know this is a little bit more touchy, but I would just say that I think in certain targeted instances, there's a concept called just transition. So for the poorest countries, so I think in some instances where it's appropriate, we should finance gas projects, for example. I think that should be less controversial than maybe some of the other things I might propose, but I think we ought to learn to love nuclear power. They're allowed to do nuclear power projects. I don't think they've done many. They have not done as many mining and minerals projects. If we're concerned about the carbon transition, we've got to learn to love mining and minerals to the tips of our toes. And I don't see a lot of minerals and mining projects done. Most people in the international development community would rather get a root canal than work on mining and minerals projects. And so I think that we need to encourage our friends at the DFC and at aid agencies if we're concerned about a carbon transition, we're going to have to do a heck of a lot more in mining and minerals. And there have been a couple of projects, and I give them credit for that. I'll stop there, Congressman.
Thank you very much. Mr. Trulio, when Congress established the program on China and transformational exports within the Export-Import Bank, it recognized the Ex-Im Bank needed to be more strategic and more aggressive in countering the CCP in strategic sectors. You've led that effort. How would you evaluate it, and what next steps should be taken to continue to improve?
Yeah, thank you for that. In 2020, we stood up the program and handed it off to the dedicated professional career staff as well as the new Biden team. I think the keys to consider is Look, the congressionally stated goal was 20% of EXIM's lending authority should be the goal for CTEP, this program. And I think a question for Congress to ask of EXIM's leadership is, well, how many deals have you done against that? Number of deals, how many deals are in the pipeline, how much of the lending authority has actually been used to that end? There have been some notable successes, but I'd say relative to need, it's falling short. And that's not to single them out. The whole enterprise that we're talking about isn't matching the challenge of the CCP. But I would look, how much of that $27 billion goal has been achieved? How many of those deals are in the pipeline? And crucially, do you have the talent within EXIM to execute those deals? Are you able to attract them, to retain them? And what's the business plan to ramp that up?
And how would you evaluate the level of coordination between some of the agencies, DFC, EXIM, USAID, MCC?
I think it's a huge challenge. I think there are a lot of people of goodwill who want to do the right thing, but institutionally we've fallen short. Back to what I said a few moments ago, who's in charge of this overall enterprise? This is a problem decades in the making, but there is no one clear lead in the interagency community who is an executing body. Certainly the National Economic Council provides policy oversight and coordination, but who's in charge? That's a huge challenge. It's unfortunately an organizational behavior challenge.
Okay, thank you. Now I'll recognize the ranking member for 5 minutes of questions.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. In 2000, the CCP issued a white paper that said it, quote, does not station any troops or set up any military bases in any foreign country, close quote. Well, the CCP cannot make that claim anymore. Today, it has a military base in Africa, a base, as you can see here, in, of all places, Argentina, and they have a suspected base in Cuba, that red star up there. It's also now building deep water ports across Latin America and the Caribbean through the BRI. And as you can see on that map, it covers the entire region. Dr. Parks, your organization recently did a study where you argued that the CCP might try to use some of these ports as military bases. Isn't that right? And Mr. Rundy, we can't even compete in terms of developing deep water ports in most of those countries because we can only, the DFC, for instance, can only lend in 4 of them, right?
That's correct, Ranking Member. We can't fight something with nothing.
Well, we got nothing in a lot of these countries. Well, let's take a specific example, Panama Canal. As we can see on this map, the canal shortens the distance to go between the east and west ports of America by 3 weeks because it takes 3 more weeks to go around South America as opposed to going through the canal. Mr. Rundy, although Panama has the operating rights to the canal itself, it's given PRC companies managing rights for these 2 ports on either side of the Panama Canal. Isn't that right?
That's correct, Ranking Member Krishnamurthy.
And in a potential conflict over Taiwan, for instance, the CCP could use its control of these entry ports to potentially delay American civilian and military shipping. Isn't that right?
Ranking Member Krishnamurthy, I share your concern. I would say that in our treaty with the government of Panama controls the entire canal, but I would say, sir, that and that we have as part of our treaty commitments that we're on the hook for defending Panama if there.
And so that could be where a conflict arises, because they control those entry points, and they could decide to delay shipping in the event of conflict.
In an ideal world, we would ultimately see that when those contracts end, which will be over the next 10 or 15 years, a chance to get those Hong Kong controlled companies out of managing those ports, sir.
Yes, sir. Let me turn to another topic, and that is the BRI saddling countries with massive debt, and it's having real impacts on real people. Take Kenya, for example. The PRC accounts for almost 3/4 of its bilateral debt, and this debt has even led to deadly unrest. In 2023, 6 people died during protests, and you can see the unrest in this picture here in Kenya. And these protests were against a proposed tax hike to pay back the debt to the PRC. Dr. Parks, this type of debt burden from the BRI, the Chinese BRI, is fueling social unrest in Kenya and in other BRI countries, right?
With respect to the tax hike issue, it is true that the Ruto administration in Kenya has increased taxes. It's also cut food and fuel subsidies to avoid defaulting on its repayment obligations to the Chinese and non-Chinese creditors. And yes, it is also true that these measures are deeply unpopular with Kenyan citizens.
And let's see what all this debt is for. Let me turn your attention to my final topic, which is policy alternatives. In Angola, there's a train network. Angola contracted with Chinese companies to rehabilitate its railways, but a year later, a Chinese maintenance train collided with a freight train, killing 18 people. There's a picture of that pileup. In fact, after 10 derailments per year, Angola said enough is enough, and so they no longer wanted China to run the railways. They turned to us. And actually, there's this corridor called the Lobito Corridor, which gives the world access to critical minerals from the Congo. The Congo's here, and this rail network goes to the coast through Angola. Now, Mr. Rundy, after the Angolans rejected the Chinese, they turned to the DFC to help to develop the Lobito Corridor, correct?
That's correct, Ranking Member.
Now tell us a little more, expand a little more, what more needs to be done to help make sure the DFC can offer this type of development to more parts of the world?
So thank you, Ranking Member, for that question. I think a couple of things. One is I think that there'll be an opportunity with the reauthorization to look at some of the things I mentioned earlier. There's also a much more wonky issue which has to do with something called equity authority, which allows the DFC to make specific kinds of more flexible investments, and the way in which we score equity according to sort of the rules of a variety of rules of the government, it makes it very difficult for that to happen. I won't get into the reasons for that here, but looking at this issue of equity authority is an important thing to review. I also think that if I look at the Lobito Corridor, I think the Biden administration has done a good thing by saying we need to bring all of our partners together. So this is a G7 initiative called the PGII. It's a mouthful, but the Lobito Corridor is sort of the first example of saying how can we all, our friends, work together to try and develop infrastructure across the Lobito Corridor. In my world, I'd love to see us, Ranking Member, have sort of 10 or 15 Lobito corridors. So one of the things we need to think about is having the ability to a little bit more flexibility with the DFC, but we also need to be able to work better with our partners. We can't do this all alone as the DFC. We should be able to be more joined up with, say, the Japanese and with the Brits and with the Australians and with the Canadians. They all want to work with us. This conversation that we're having is being had in Tokyo, in Ottawa, in London, in Canberra. So we're pushing on an open door. So I think working in partnership is an important part of this, Ranking Member.
Great, thank you.
Representative Luchtenmeyer.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and congratulations. Welcome to your new position. Hope it doesn't have as many headaches as the past chairman had to deal with. Mr. Rundy, great to see you again. You appeared in front of our Financial Services Subcommittee last May and did a great job, and appreciate your participation today. Can you describe China's role at the IDB and how that came about? Was that a mistake? How do we mitigate that, and what can we do to help Taiwan?
So it seemed like a good idea at the time, sir. From a 40-year period, Republican and Democratic administrations had a policy of what's called responsible stakeholder theory, of saying if we can bring the People's Republic of China into various international institutions, that would be a good thing. And at the time, we said, okay, well, we'll have China join the Inter-American Development Bank. This was an idea that was started in the Bush administration, but then was fully implemented in the Obama administration. So we can't blame either one, but I think in retrospect, I don't think it was such a great idea. What we could have done at the time is we could have said, we'll let you in, but if you want to come in, we got to let Taiwan in. So as you know, Congressman, in the Asian Development Bank, Taiwan is a shareholder of the Asian Development Bank as an economy. Taiwan is also a member of the WTO. We said to China, we'll let you into the WTO, which maybe wasn't so great either, but we're going to let Taiwan in as an economy. So there's like a specific kind of diplomatic way they did it. So if I were to have done it over again, I'd have said, let Taiwan in. I would like to see, as part of this potential capital increase for the Inter-American Development Bank's private sector arm, I would love it if the Congress were to say to the Biden administration because this is a political conversation, we should say, okay, we'll buy in some shares, but we would like Taiwan to buy into the the private sector arm of the Inter-American Development Bank.
Thank you for that. Also, Mr. Rundy, in your 7 ideas to help you guys compete better with China, you indicate that securitizing infrastructure and enticing private capital in this is an interesting idea as we're talking more about the world financial institutions type stuff. Can you give me just a little idea on what you're thinking here with regards to privatizing or get some private money in here?
Yes,
Is
sir.
it looking at government guarantees on this, or just strictly like a secondary mortgage market?
So think of it like a secondary mortgage market or a secondary credit card market. We had to kind of have standardization. So this attempt to try and have standardization of quality through the Blue Dot network, I think a variety of smart people are looking at this. So the International Finance Corporation, which is part of the World Bank Group, has been tasked by the G7 and by the Biden administration to say, like, can we try and push on this? It probably requires some kind of guarantees from the United States. It probably requires some pushing on trying to get better standardization.
Do you see an appetite on the private side for this?
I think over time, I think the answer to that is yes. I think I could think of a lot of really well-run countries where I could totally see that. I think one of our superpowers is that we have private capital. We have capital markets. We have institutional investors. We're not bringing those into this conversation. This is a way to bring those into this conversation, sir.
Very good, thank you. Mr. Trulio, one of the things I do is I chair the Subcommittee on National Security and the Financial Services Committee, and XM Bank is under our purview, and so we deal a lot with that. I thank you for your comments on it this morning. To me, I think it's a really important agency for our businesses in this country to be able to compete on a national basis, and we've got China in the mix here, which is unfortunate because they seem to be able to utilize that bank a lot better than our own folks here in this country. One of the things I found over the last few months here is nuclear reactor construction. And this is a way the rest of the world can really help themselves and their economies of their countries. And yet we really have a problem. There's not necessarily a prejudice. There's a prejudice against it, not necessarily some sort of hard, fast rule against financing this. We need to find a way to break through that barrier. Have you got some ideas? Because I think our nuclear reactor companies in this country that construct these things could be very competitive.
And Congressman, I agree with the thrust of your question, and further to your point, to the extent that we want to do good things for the environment, those who care about carbon, nuclear is really essential to that conversation for it to be serious. So a few things specifically, the China Transformational Exports Program that Congress breathed into life names 10 sectors. Nuclear is not one of them. That, I think, is a very straightforward opportunity to.
Now, this is the one that's being renewed in 2026, correct?
So EXIM's reauthorization, the whole thing is in 2026. Okay. The 2019 reauthorization included a provision breathing life into a.
So in that reauthorization, we could sort of direct them to be able to be more aggressive in this.
Absolutely. It could be one of the 10, or it could be the 11th or the 12th or whatever. I think the point is, the list of those 10 technologies was from back in 2019, and there's no reason why nuclear shouldn't be part of that as in the context of China competition. And more broadly, from an oversight perspective, I would respectfully suggest that the EXIM leadership should be queried very specifically about all the technologies, including nuclear, that contribute to robust China competition.
Thank you. My time has expired. I yield back to Chairman.
Representative Moulton.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and congratulations again. President Xi Jinping goes around the world promising win-win cooperation. But I think we've seen time and again that it's really not win-win. It's China wins, you lose. That's how it goes. So let's look at the case of Djibouti, for example. The PRC spent a whopping $14 billion between 2012 and 2020 for a country with fewer than 1 million people, a GDP below $2 billion, and almost no natural resources. In 2017, the PRC built its first overseas military base in Djibouti, just 7 kilometers from our U.S. base. Now, Beijing says the base is there to protect freedom of navigation, but we saw just this past year, when merchant ships in the region started getting hit by Houthi rebels, China refused to join a U.S.-led coalition to protect international trade. So these massive investments in Djibouti have literally put the country in the PRC's debt. In fact, the PRC holds more than $1.4 billion of Djibouti's debt, the equivalent of some 45%, almost half the country's GDP. Mr. Chairman, I'd like to enter into the record a statement from the Chinese Foreign Ministry dated December 9th, 2022, summarizing a meeting between President Xi and the President of Djibouti. The statement says, quote, "We appreciate Djibouti's valuable support for China on issues related to Taiwan, Hong Kong, and Xinjiang, and China will continue to support Djibouti. The trade-off is clear as day. You support China as it threatens an invasion, dismantles Hong Kong's democracy, and conducts a genocide, and China will continue to lend you money." So, Mr. Rundy, how can the U.S. counter these efforts and help countries get out from under this China trap?
Thank you, Congressman. This is one of the great challenges of our time. I think it's underappreciated, so I really appreciate you raising this. There are many, and Ranking Member Krishnamurthy also alluded to this, that there are many developing countries in places like Africa where they're spending more on interest payments than they are on basic education. They're spending more on interest payments to China than they are on health care. That's crazy. 25 years ago, the United States led a major debt forgiveness initiative at the turn of the century. And at the time, the Congress said this was going to be one and done. We're not going to do this again. And so now it's very unfortunate and ironic that we find ourselves in this new developing country debt crisis where much of the debt is controlled by the People's Republic of China and then some controlled by hedge funds. 40 years ago, 5 or 10 people would have gotten in a cigar-filled room and they'd have kind of worked it out among a handful of banks. It's much, instead of having 11 or 12, we now have 1,200 debt holders, so it's much more difficult. Ultimately, we're going to have some sort of a haircut on the debt. China doesn't want to have a haircut because if they give a haircut to Djibouti or Zambia, that means they'll say, well, we can get a haircut in Shenzhen, and it's going to create problems there. They're also unwilling to be transparent. They don't follow the Marquis of Queensberry rules about how debt is followed. That's called the Paris Club rules. And so there have been attempts to try and do that through the G20. Ultimately, we're going to need countries to be better stewards of their money because we're in a real pickle here. So I think ultimately we're going to have to force the Chinese to some kind of a haircut, and we're going to have to force them to operate in a more transparent way. But it's very unfortunate we've ended at this situation.
Look, I mean, that's not going to be easy to do. China has a clear strategy here. I mean, we can whine about how they're putting these countries in debt, but it's in some ways, from China's perspective, pretty smart because they're beholden to China, and they follow their policy. So, Mr. Trulio, what do you think about this, and how should the United States adopt our foreign assistance strategies to meet this challenge?
Sure. Well, look, we have the basic tools. They're the organizational issues I mentioned, but I think we need to really energize those tools. So I mentioned defense in my opening statement. I think we need to repeal the statutory prohibition on XM financing defense articles and services. Congressman, you're a veteran. You understand that when militaries start working together, when U.S. products and services, which are high quality, become part of an ally or partner's portfolio, that's training, it's maintenance, it's relationships over many, many years. There's no reason why we shouldn't use that as one very specific, very actionable tool. I think we need to look at XM's content policy. You know, it's antiquated. We need to move much more towards a export value and jobs created approach as opposed to the pure actual content provided. And then also, we can talk more about it certainly if we have more time, but raise the statutory default limit from 2% to 4%. Right now, it's a sword of Damocles. The bank has to shut down lending operations if they cross over that 2%.
Great.
That's not a healthy way to do business.
Thank you very much. Thank you both. Mr. Chairman, I yield back.
And without objection, your statement will be added to the record. Representative Newhouse.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and it's great to see you in the chairman's seat there. Good morning. Thanks to our witnesses for being here and also for your expert testimonies this morning on the Belt and Road Initiative. You guys may not know this, but the committee does, and a lot of the public does. We've now held more than a dozen hearings on this committee. And this one, I think in particular, brings up that burning question: does the Chinese Communist Party aspire world domination? From massive infrastructure projects, global resource wars, to high-tech surveillance technologies, truly the CCP is exporting economic coercion and authoritarian capitalism. Kind of a lightning round question. I want each of the witnesses to describe the Belt and Road Initiative in one sentence.
I'll go first. It's a very sophisticated strategic effort to put China in a dominant position in the world.
Very good.
Congressman, it's seductive. It's a seductive, positive, forward-looking agenda that speaks to the hopes and aspirations of developing countries. If we don't have an answer to it, they're going to take their business to the CCP.
It is a effort to help Chinese companies win commercial advantages overseas. It's also a program to solve domestic economic problems inside China.
Good. Not a trick question. Just wanted to get your quick thoughts on that perspective. Mr. Trulio, in your written testimony, you expressed how there's no simple answer to the question of who's in charge of addressing the challenges posed by the BRI. So let me ask you, how would you recommend we reorganize all of these different agencies tasked with international trade and develop to counter the BRI? And I'm a farmer, a third-generation farmer, so in your answer, would you please touch on the role of the USDA in these efforts? Because we know firsthand how important it is that we need to stand up to the CCP.
Yeah, absolutely, Congressman, and thank you for the question. In fact, in the written testimony which you referenced, I actually listed the Department of Agriculture first. It's one of a dozen departments and agencies that are players on the field here. And look, this is nobody came up with this approach deliberately. This is a problem decades in the making. We have a very robust interagency team, and they're all off doing things in a spirit of goodwill and according to their missions. But people respond to incentives, right? So the incentives are for them to work in their silo, and we have not done enough as a country and as a government to incentivize that behavior. So one of the very concrete steps is there needs to be an executive branch strategy on economic competition. That is going to force out issues of trade-offs, who's in the lead, what are the objectives, what are the specific courses of action, what should be resourced and what shouldn't be resourced. Let's reevaluate what these decades-long, in some cases, programs, what are they actually, what's the return on investment there? And then I think it's an opportunity for Congress and the executive to designate or further empower certain natural lead departments and agencies. So obviously the State Department and USTR play critical roles here, but so does Commerce and so does Treasury. How robustly resourced is Commerce relative to its really important mission? That's a problem right now, and again, it's been decades in the making. So I think the strategy forces that out, but congressional oversight will really help focus in on solutions.
Appreciate that. Mr. Rundy, as you know, China has recently reformed the BRI lending strategies based on, I think, legitimate accusations of debt trap diplomacy and certainly unsustainable business models following the 2015 stock market sell-off, as well as the COVID-19 pandemic, which both derailed some of their efforts in solvency as well as lost tremendous project value. Do you think some of their recent reforms, referred to as BRI 2.0, will actually change any of their predatory lending practices?
So I thought Dr. Parks's testimony was very helpful in that regard. The CCP is smart. I don't like them, but they're smart.
They are.
And so I just think they do respond to these sorts of complaints. their tendency will be to kind of return to what they were doing originally, but they are having to respond to these challenges. And so I think Dr. Parks' point about that we need to not respond to BRI 1.0, we need to respond to BRI 2.0 is on point, sir.
Good. And Mr. Chairman, just real quickly, I'd like to commend Dr. Parks and his team. Your researchers pieced together the complex web of BRI investments, and that's going to continue to be a very important resource that help measure and guide our strategic responses. So thank you very much. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Representative Brown.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. As we've heard this morning, the Chinese Communist Party is attempting to promote its interests around the world through its far-reaching Belt and Road Initiative. We should all be concerned about the CCP's use of predatory lending to developing nations, offering high-risk loans in the short term, which have unwanted and negative long-term consequences. While the CCP's handouts may seem like a great deal up front, we must continue to remind all nations of the cost and risk associated with accepting Chinese investments directed, controlled, and overseen by the CCP. The Biden-Harris administration is confronting this challenge by bringing together nations from all corners of the globe to defend the international order. In fact, President Biden united the European Union, India, Saudi Arabia, and other nations to establish the India-Middle East-Europe Economic Corridor. This historic effort is likely to make trading from Europe to India 40% faster, saving time, cutting costs, and reducing our supply chain's dependence on China. President Biden also recently announced the Partnership for Global Infrastructure and Investment Corridor to integrate our partners in the Indo-Pacific, including the Philippines and Japan. These Biden-led programs are just two substantial examples of a direct counter to the CCP's plans, putting the United States and our partners back on the map. So, Dr. Parks, can you speak to the significance of these two Biden-Harris initiatives and other ways President Biden is bringing together our partners to counter the CCP's Belt and Road Initiative?
I think there are a number of efforts underway that are kind of positioned under the banner of PGII. I think the Biden administration has articulated that it wants to develop a value proposition in the global infrastructure market that's really anchored in this idea of quality infrastructure. What I would like to see on a going forward basis is to kind of be more specific about what that means. So I think about this from the demand side of the equation. To outcompete China, the USG value proposition needs to be sufficiently different. So does that mean we're going to set economic rate of return thresholds for project approval? Does that mean we're going to have robust monitoring and evaluation standards to facilitate impact measurement? What does quality infrastructure mean? At the end of the day, developing countries are comparison shopping. And so I think the Biden administration's onto something with this quality infrastructure idea, but I think we need to move beyond the buzzword. We need to make it very tangible for our would-be partners in the developing world.
Thank you. The Biden-Harris administration has also made investments here at home to bring all aspects of the manufacturing supply chain back to American soil. The Inflation Reduction Act and CHIPS and Science and the Bipartisan Infrastructure Law all have contributed to a booming American manufacturing economy. In the United States, the president's Investing in America agenda has already created more than $860 billion in investment in everything from chips manufacturing to electric vehicle factories. To quote President Biden, American workers and businesses can outcompete anyone as long as they have fair competition. Dr. Parks, can you speak to the increased growth and success of the United States competition on the world stage in critical sectors like clean energy, chips manufacturing, and infrastructure under the Biden-Harris administration?
That's outside my area of expertise. I'm sorry.
Oh, okay. Well, thank you for that. I will say this in closing. President Biden continues to shape a brighter path for the United States and the global economy, one which puts fair trading practices, domestic manufacturing, and everyday Americans first. It is truly exciting to see the growth of American industry in the last couple of years and what will continue for decades to come, thanks to our historic investments. And with that, Mr. Chairman, I yield back.
Thank you. Representative Johnson.
Thanks, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Rundy, we've had experts from across the political spectrum tell this committee for 18 months that the Chinese Communist Party seeks to gain coercive economic power over almost every corner of the globe. I liked your testimony comparing the relative size of the Development Finance Corporation's portfolio, or the loans last year, to those of the Belt and Road Initiative. So let's underline that a little bit. What was the size of the deal flow that the DFC made?
Thank you, Congressman. Last year, the DFC did about $9 billion.
Okay, so $9 billion. What's the similar comparison to the Belt and Road Initiative?
Thank you, Congressman. The Belt and Road Initiative, all in, various spigots, about $90 billion, sir.
Yeah. So I loved in your testimony that you called out the fact that if we're trying to make it seem as though this is an answer to the Belt and Road Initiative, we are off by an order of magnitude. And we just need to call out that there is a lot of additional work to be done here. Now, clearly, there is not a singular source for American soft power, but this tool in our toolbox is substantially smaller than the commensurate tool that China is using. That's fair to say.
That's fair to say, Congressman, and I've heard very intelligent people say that our answer to Belt and Road is the DFC. It's an important instrument. I'm all for it. I was involved with setting it up, but it's not sufficient to respond fully to the Belt and Road. They are 10 times bigger in terms of what they're doing than what the DFC is doing on an annual basis, sir.
Congressman, if I could interject, also there's also a speed issue, right? So it's volume and also velocity of how quickly we can do deals.
Yeah, at some point, if people view working with us as overly bureaucratic and slow, you're going to see good deal flow go elsewhere, right? And unfortunately, look to the Chinese Communist Party, which is not where we want them to look. I liked your comments about making sure that the DFC is capable of working with some middle and upper income countries. I'm working with Mr. Stanton on the Semiconductor Supply Chain Security and Diversification Act. We're the two leaders of that push. Now, obviously, that's an industry-specific push. It would make it easier for us to make investments in the semiconductor industry, both upstream and downstream. Is that kind of, number one, is that what we should be doing, looking at that kind of an industry to make investments?
Yes, sir. I think so. I want to just echo Mr. Trulio's point. I think there's this issue of speed. Japan, in response to Belt and Road, has made a commitment in its agencies to respond to an infrastructure idea within 11 months. We might actually say we'd like agencies to make some sort of a commitment to say we're going to have some kind of, if you come in that door with an idea, we'll give you a straight up or down answer within 12 months. That seems like a pretty reasonable thing. So I think yes, sir, on speed, and then yes, sir, on your question about supply chains and what you're describing. I think we should be using the DFC for those sorts of things, sir.
And so an industry-specific approach, we've done a little bit of that in the past with the DFC. Is it reasonable to do that in other industries?
Yes, sir. I would, for example, suggest mining would be one, undersea cables would be another, ports would be another. I think we ought to have special initiatives. I think there's some very excellent professionals, both at the political level and at the career level at the DFC. I think with some additional tools, they could do even more, sir.
So I'd like to turn our attention to 2021, Ecuador. We made an agreement to, I guess you'd call it, refinance some of the debt that Ecuador had with the Chinese, with the PRC. We had some commitments there as a part of the framework that said you can't have Huawei as a part of your telecommunications networks. Now, from what I understand, that framework is not being pursued any longer. So I think my question would be, number one, why is that? And number two, are those kinds of strings, do we want strings like that attached to these DFC deals?
So, Congressman, I think it's really important. If the Chinese Communist Party wants to build a farm-to-market road in the middle of nowhere, we shouldn't worry about that. But if they want to make a play to control the digital rails of the future through the unholy trinity of Huawei, ZTE, and Alipay, we ought to do everything we can to stop that. So I'm open to creative ideas to stop it. And so I do think we need to enable an alternative so that Huawei, ZTE, and Alipay don't control the digital rails of the future, sir.
Yeah. With my time remaining, Mr. Chairman, I would like to submit for the record on behalf of Mr. Jimenez, who led the letter, although I also signed on to it, to the embassy in Panama, calling out some of the issues that the ranking member talked about and concerns that we would like further pursued.
Without objection, it will be added to the hearing record.
Thanks much.
Representative Auchincloss.
Thank you, Chair. This has been a terrific hearing, and I appreciate the testimony from our experts. Mr. Runde, you note in your written testimony that in the long run, infrastructure investments follow trade. Regrettably, trade has become a four-letter word in Congress. That's unfortunate because ultimately, reciprocal market access is one of the most compelling things that the United States has in our competition with the Chinese Communist Party globally. And I think there is a grand bargain that needs to be struck here in Congress first, in which we acknowledge and organize behind de-risking from China and recognizing that China has been cheating in the global rules-based trading order, but then complementing that de-risking from China by then further engaging with the global South and with developing nations in trade and investment ties. It's got to be a 1-2 punch, not merely a stick, but also a carrot. To that end, this committee almost unanimously has supported the concept of reauthorizing the generalized system of preferences, which is really functionally that grand bargain crystallized in a single policy. It is reducing trade ties with China while simultaneously increasing them with the global South. Mr. Runde, can you speak about how reauthorizing GSP would help us outcompete the Belt and Road Initiative?
Thank you, Congressman. That's a really important question. Thank you for asking this. So all of our trade deals, all of them, have had a geopolitical reason behind them. I could use the term geoeconomic, but for this, there's been something other than trade has been behind every trade deal we've ever done since World War II. When we said we're going to set up the GATT after World War II as part of the Bretton Woods Institution to rebuild the world, NAFTA, now USMCA. So we do need a grand bargain. I think GSP has been an important set of rules of the game. It's lapsed for 4 years. It's a problem. It's part of our offer to developing countries, and so we need to reestablish GSP. And getting AGOA done, the African Growth and Opportunity Act, is somewhat linked to GSP. So we do need a grand bargain. 25 years ago, we led the world. 120 countries. We were their #1 trading partner. In China, there were 60. That's flipped. They're now the #1 trading partner for 120 countries. It's hard for us to, tell developing countries if their biggest trading partner, their biggest debt holder is China. You really ought to do this, or really ought to do that, or really consider this, or really ought to consider that. It's really important. So I really appreciate your question, Congressman.
Thank you. Market access has to be part of the conversation here. I want to press further, Mr. Trulio, on crowding in private capital to this conversation. I'll associate myself with the comments from Mr. Lukemeyer about the importance of tapping into really what is a strong U.S. advantage here, which is that we have long-term, patient, disciplined, sophisticated capital that wants to be invested in infrastructure, particularly infrastructure in emerging economies that's going to pay big dividends. I hear the points about DFC reforms, equity scoring, and I also hear the points that it's necessary but insufficient as part of a toolkit. What else can we be doing besides your EXIM recommendations, besides your DFC recommendations, to get trillions of dollars of private capital off the sidelines and investing in Africa and ASEAN nations?
Thank you, Congressman. Look, I think it's a combination of individual wins on the policy level. There are of course huge organizational issues that we talked about earlier, but making it clear who's in charge and how to pursue it, how to pursue opportunities. But I think basically my own direct experience was that the private sector gets frustrated and then kind of just walks away or thinks this is too hard.
Is it because do they get frustrated because they don't feel like they have one phone number to call in Washington, or do they get frustrated because of the risk premium that they have to pay in developing economies that doesn't get
Well, it's certainly who's in charge, who do we talk to. There's, you have to go around town. A lot of companies, especially the innovative, smaller to medium-sized enterprises, they don't have people in Washington. They don't have consultants here who can help navigate all that. That certainly imposes a cost on them. So those are huge challenges. And then so we make it hard to use these tools, even though we're paying for these tools as taxpayers, and we walk away. There's an added element too that we haven't really addressed, which is we're behind on some of these key technologies. I lived through this on the 5G issue. There was no specific U.S. solution or counter to Huawei or ZTE. So having to, we need as a country to work with other allies and partners, for example, Samsung and Nokia and Ericsson from South Korea, from Finland and Sweden. We're going to have to work together creatively like that to come up with the counter. As Mr. Rundy said, you can't beat a comprehensive offer from the Chinese with nothing, or with a new project to go figure it out on a bespoke basis.
Another example of the grand bargain here is what I'm hearing is that just like GSP is about trade with the global south to counterdict trade with China, commercial diplomacy with our developed economy allies, Japan, South Korea, for everything from 5G to
Absolutely.
maritime, needs to be strengthened.
In Europe and in Asia, that is going to be really important.
I'll yield back.
Representative Steele.
Congratulations to your chairmanship, and thank you for chairman and ranking member holding this really important hearing today, and thank you all the witnesses coming out. I'm just so grateful. I want to submit for a record a recent article that I wrote, CCP Belt and Road Influence in South America, called President Biden Must Get Serious About China's South American Ambitions. Thank you. You know, this is not just, it's all over the world. In the Pacific region, developing countries, African countries that we Ways and Means Committee had a Cordell trip and we went. I see these small developing countries that they actually see a lot of Chinese investment coming in. They're building highways, ports, airport, and then in the Pacific region, same thing. And South America, it's our backyard. And you know what? This is very, very dangerous. And we really have to take seriously. And on the actually article that I wrote about Peruvian capital of Lima, that they were building the gateway from South America to Asia, they put $3.5 billion investment, and they're building 15 terminals, mobilize more than 5 million containers annually. And this morning we got the news that actually they are building the tunnel under that city. They're 1.8 kilometers, it's about 1.1 mile, that under the city, and it collapsed. This under the city means that they try to hide something, that this highway, 1.1 mile highway, is very, very long under the city. I mean, I'm glad that it's collapsed, that we found out from the news this morning. But I cannot say really happy for Peru, but for what China's, what they try to build. How much we have to take seriously, because this is national security issues, because they are building this airport, and they try to use actually that for next war, and they try to dominate the world. How important it is, and how are we going to prevent that? Because it seems like every countries that you go, Cambodia, Taiwan, Thailand, and other areas, that you see a lot this infrastructure buildings, and then what they do is that these countries that cannot pay for it, then they take over charging of it. So how we're going to prevent, and how we're going to go out there? And we spent actually one of the African country that almost we invest the same amount as China. But you know what? China, it's a favorable rate. It's almost same as America. So how are we going to work with these countries, and how are we going to get out, and then actually our infrastructure building and other stuffs that we work together with our allies?
Congresswoman, thank you for this very important question. There's not one answer to this really important question, but we need to do several things a lot better. We need to have better commercial intelligence to know when these projects are coming. We need better commercial diplomacy. So, for example, in Africa, I think we have from the Commerce Department something like 11, don't quote me on this, 11 foreign and commercial service officers in the continent of Africa. And I think there's something like 11 foreign and commercial service officers in the country of Germany. So we need to, I think, maybe perhaps look at this issue of how many foreign commercial service officers we have in these countries, because they're part of this. We got to work with our friends and allies. We can't do this alone. I've explained that we on our own can't do this. We should be lashed up with Japan. We should be lashed up with the Australians and the Canadians. We should ride herd on the multilateral development banks. The Inter-American Development Bank is a major financier of infrastructure. They have really excellent professionals. Peru is a friend. They would like more. All these countries, most of the time, if they were given a choice, they would like America to be there. They always ask, I'm sure, Congresswoman, you were in Africa, like, where is the United States? I'm sure you were asked this question. So we need to make it easier for our American businesses to be there. There are ways to do that. But absolutely we should be concerned because there's dual use concerns with these ports and military use, but also triple use in terms of viewing it for intelligence operations, et cetera. So absolutely we should be concerned, Congresswoman.
So I have just a little bit of time that, I've been raising awareness about lodging. It's a maritime tracking system, the Chinese system that a lot of our allies are using it. Japan, South Korea, Portugal, Spain. And I'm glad that actually lodging legislation was included in the fiscal year 24 NDAA, so I'm very happy about that. But you know what? This is not just like a trade issue and other issues, but you know what? This is actually national issues, national security issues, because our Navy ships are going out to these ports. They know exactly what time and when they are, getting to the port and they are leaving to the port from the port. So, you know what, we have to work much harder, and I'm so happy to be in this committee because, we can really show the awareness of what China does, and we really have to study more. So thank you very much, and I yield back.
Thank you. And Representative Hinson.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Good morning to our witnesses today. If there's one thing that's abundantly clear, it's that the relationships that the Chinese Communist Party is developing around the world are nothing more than truly aggressive, blatant attempts to undermine Western influence and democracy on the world stage. China, as we know, is playing a zero-sum game here, and President Xi intends to wrap up as much of the world as he can in this Belt and Road Initiative debt trap diplomacy. So it is extremely concerning that we see one of China's largest exports of technology is surveillance-related systems to weak democracies and authoritarian governments. A couple companies, Huawei, ZTE, many other companies are involved in this AI surveillance technology. And they've supplied that to over 60 countries so far that we've tracked, and you may have better data on that specifically. But of these, we know 36 nations have signed on to China's Belt and Road Initiative. So again, this is the CCP blatantly spreading their surveillance state around the world. So my first question, Mr. Rundy, are we seeing a correlation between the exports of this surveillance technology tied with these Belt and Road agreements as a mean for the coalition building, continuing to spread their influence? And then how does that surveillance state in these other countries benefit the CCP?
Thank you, Congresswoman. I would say, yes, absolutely. There's also another technology called nuke tech. So nuke tech is like X-ray equipment and looking at looking for nuclear weapons and other sorts of things that they make. That's like the Huawei of security industries, and they're exporting it to our allies as well. So I think what you're raising is something very critical, Congresswoman. Absolutely, this sort of technology, China is exporting a form of techno-authoritarianism. The bad guys are getting better at being bad, and this sort of technology allows the bad guys to be better at being bad. So I do think there's absolutely a link between the export of these surveillance technologies and sort of a closing of democratic space. We should absolutely see this, and also deeper linkages. They're absolutely aligning with bad actors. There is an alliance of bad countries. The Star Wars bar of countries is aligned against us. So think of it, it's China, it's Vladimir Putin's murderous regime, Belarus. I mean, it's all these thug regimes.
It's BRICS. Yes,
It's all these
the BRICS
thug
initiative.
regimes, and so think of it like the Star Wars bar of countries, and they would like to overthrow the Western international order, and so this techno-authoritarianism, this surveillance technologies, is a way in which they are trying to make a play to do that. Thank you, Congresswoman.
Yes, absolutely. We know this is designed to establish an alternative world order, correct? And so we know Brazil and Russia would be able to dominate the world's supply of raw materials by 2050, coincides with China's goal of being the dominant power by 2049. So if the blatant nature of this Belt and Road Ponzi scheme wasn't enough, BRICS should be, I kind of think, the final evidence of China's intentions here to undermine the West. Mr. Trulio, how do you anticipate the BRICS bloc really helping with China's sway, with the influence there, and what concerns do you see arising from its recent expansion?
So my huge concern, Congresswoman, is not only with BRICS, but also just the whole nature of the trading partner relationships. And Mr. Rundy referenced how many #1 trading partners China has around the world. I believe I'm correct to say that Brazil's #1 trading partner is now China. When one thinks of the Western Hemisphere, one might logically think that it would be the United States that would be the #1 trading partner of a lot of these countries, but it's not, and that has huge implications politically, militarily, economically. So that trend is certainly very concerning. And you mentioned the BRICS. I want to zero in specifically on Brazil, a hugely important country to the United States and to the Western Hemisphere. Over 200 million people, an enormous economy, tremendous depths of innovation among the people there, a huge potential market for us. And yet, if we think of where is Brazil in the policy conversation in the United States and the diplomatic conversation, I would argue it's not where it's supposed to be.
Right. We have ceded many of those authorities by not being more aggressive on trade, which is something I think we need to absolutely be doing. Trade and supply chain, I think those are the two things where we need to address immediately. So supply chain, when you look at how China's been undercutting markets and global competitors, that's incredibly important when it comes to our pharmaceuticals. So Dr. Parks, how might China's capacity to expedite pharmaceutical innovation and development and leveraging subsidies, data collection, clinical trials really affect the global pharmaceutical market?
I'm afraid I can't speak to that issue. I don't know if any of my fellow witnesses are better positioned.
Yeah.
Well, look, if we think of what are the critical areas that are vulnerabilities, but also key technologies or capabilities in the future, if we had a blank piece of paper, we would never design a system where we depended on China for critical pharmaceutical chemicals. It's just ridiculous, right? So, but that's, I think, where it's not just we need to do more here inside the United States, which we do, but also working with our friends and allies, whether it's Canada, Mexico, or Italy, whatever, what have you, friendly countries that share our values, right? Freedom, democracy, individual liberty, that should be the filter by which we assess.
Absolutely. Thank you.
Congresswoman, when they said they were going to cut off our pills and cut off our ventilators during COVID, those were grounds for a divorce. So we need to have reshoring and nearshoring and friendshoring of pharmaceuticals. And so I appreciate you raising this question.
Thank you. Thanks to our witnesses. And Mr. Chairman, I yield back. Thank you.
Thank you. I want to thank all the members, especially want to thank our witnesses today. Questions for the record are due 1 week from today. And without objection, the committee hearing is adjourned.